Hey, this is Scott from Oak Ridge. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Life Minutes. We've been talking about grace and how God gives us grace. Grace is God giving us something we don't deserve, and in turn, us showing that same grace to others in all areas of our life. Today, I want to talk about probably a difficult subject to some, and that is experiencing God's grace when difficulties hit, when those thorns, we could call them, come into our life. Johnny Erickson Tata just turned 70. If you're not familiar with Johnny, for over 50 years, Johnny has been confined to a wheelchair. She broke her neck in a diving accident as a teenager. For these many decades, God has used Johnny to minister to people all around the world. We recently heard her in Nashville, Tennessee, and what a spirit that she has. She is in pain all the time. Johnny, when that event happened over 50 years ago, her and others prayed for healing, that her neck would be healed, her paralysis and would go away, and she wasn't healed. Johnny wanted children, but she had none. She is married from whatever anybody hears, to a wonderful husband, Ken. Their testimony and her testimony, despite the trials that she has gone through, is just unbelievable. Her love for God in the midst of the thorns that have been a part of her life is a testament to the fact that she knows that she has a gracious, loving God who is with her and with us in all of life's difficulties. Being a Christian is not a guarantee that life is easy. James chapter 1 talks about the fact that trials, difficulties happen in our life. We can learn from them. They do form our character depending on how we respond. Romans 5 reminds us of that. We live in a broken world. Sometimes things just happen. At other times, God allows trials into our life to help us become more like Jesus. The point is, it's not the difficulties that come, it's how we respond to those times in our life. How we respond really is based on our understanding of grace. Do we really believe that even when life is throwing us curveballs, that God loves us even in those moments? If we understand grace, we know that He is with us in those moments. The Apostle Paul, who wrote 13 books of the New Testament, talks about thorns, difficulties. He also talks about God's grace and what he has learned about God as he has faced difficult times. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul talks about what he terms a thorn in the flesh. We don't know exactly what the thorn was. There's differing opinions on that. But whatever it was a difficult thing for Paul. It's interesting that when you read about the thorn in the flesh that he had, the previous verses he talked about the fact that he had been taken to heaven. Now there's a place in the book of Acts in which Paul was stoned. He got smacked quite hard with a number of rocks and was left for dead. Some people think that it was at that moment that God took him on a journey to heaven, but then brought him back to life. We don't know for sure. But the one thing we do know is this, that Paul had gone to heaven and God had told him, you can't tell anybody about it. He was not allowed to talk about what he had seen and experienced. Previous to the passage in 2 Corinthians 12 and his journey to heaven, Paul had talked about many of the things that he had gone through in his life as a follower of Jesus. Just listen to some of these. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews 40 lashes less one. 40 lashes on the back with a whip was considered, almost capital punishment. It was like the 40th lash of a whip was bring you near death. He says 5 times I received 39. 3 times I was beaten with rods. I was stoned once with rocks. 3 times I was shipwrecked. Day and a night I was adrift at sea, and danger from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my own people, the Jews, danger from Gentiles, non-Jews, danger in the city, everywhere, and toil and hardship, sleepless nights, hunger and thirst, cold and exposure. And then he says in verse 28, and apart from other things, there's the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. Who is weak and I'm not weak? But he says, I will boast of God the Father in my weakness. So he's gone through all of this stuff, all these trials. He had the opportunity to go to heaven, but he talks about a thorn. And a thorn can be anything. Maybe you're in the midst of a trial today, or something's going on in your life and you're just waiting for God to take you through it, finish it out, whatever it might be. For Johnny Erickson Toddy, when her quote, thorn will be over? When she's in heaven, in her glorified body. But Johnny's attitude is everything, and so is ours when life hits. So here's what Paul tells us. He's not having a brag fest when he talks about the things he went through. He's just recounting what happened with him and how God had been with him in those rough times. So what do we do when we're up against the thorns? Well, we have to keep our focus. And this is a walk of faith, a belief. We have to focus on God's unconditional love and acceptance. So first, listen to this. We cannot experience God's grace to make it through those difficulties, those thorns, if we're proud and arrogant. Paul says that the thorn kept him from being proud, from being self-sufficient. The only way that we experience God's grace is to humbly come before him and recognize our need for him. Man, when life hits hard, I need God's grace. I bet you do too, right? Paul saw that. He had to humbly admit, says, I need Christ. My thorn keeps me leaning on Christ. It's so easy to become self-sufficient, figure, I'll get it all worked out myself. We discover that's not the answer. We can't often make it on our own. James 4:6 says that God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. The second thing about learning grace when we're getting poked by the thorns in life is that we need to take our thorn to God. James 1:5 says we ask for wisdom. We don't understand what's happening in our life. We ask God. He may give you the answer right away. He may not, but the response that we have to have is, Lord, I'm leaving it in your hands. 3 times Paul asked for the thorn to be removed. He thought this is going to hinder me in serving God. But you know what? God didn't remove the thorn. And not only that, keep this in mind. When Paul asked for the thorn to be removed 3 times, God never rebukes Paul for asking. He doesn't condemn Paul and say, how dare you ask me to remove this trial from your life. He never rebukes Paul. That's grace. The issue always comes back to, what will our response be if we ask for the thorn to be taken away and it doesn't happen? If we become bitter and angry, we're not going to experience God's grace. In fact, we'll push God away. Paul's preparing for whatever God is going to do. You take the thorn to God, and God says, I'm here. And I'm going to walk with you all the way through it. The third thing is we experience grace as we depend on God to help us deal with the thorns. So we've just said that. God's grace was enough to help Paul deal with the difficulties. In fact, I love what he says. My grace, God is speaking to Paul, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Paul says, you know what? I'll boast in my weaknesses if I can experience God's grace and power. There is a fourth thing that I want to mention. So no matter what happens, you go through a difficult time and you work through it, that doesn't mean you forget about God's grace. We must continue looking to God's grace to make it through life. Paul said, for the sake of Christ, in verse 10 of 2 Corinthians 12, I'm content, he says. Whether it be weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecution, and calamities, I got God's grace on my side. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong. See, God's grace, his giving us what we don't deserve, extends beyond just becoming a Christian. God walks with us through our own personal hells. He carries us. Why? Because he loves us. There's no thorn that escapes God's eyes. There's no trial in our life that he doesn't know about and he doesn't want to help us through. Grace for the thorns. There's not a Christian watching this video or someone who's just thinking about Christianity watching this video who has never gone through a hard time in their life. But if you're a Christian, remember this. There's an awesome, gracious God holding you tight. And by faith, you have to believe that. He wants to show you grace. Because why? He loves us. This is Scott from Oak Ridge. Thanks for checking in. Have a great week.